Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Andy Kusa. I'm the Senior Program Officer at Springpoint Partners, and we are thrilled to be able to continue our webinar series on adolescent brain science in partnership with the Center for Developing Adolescents at UCLA. Over the course of these sessions, one of the constant themes that continues to rise to the top is there's always questions about social media, right? Too often, though, we see this massive disconnect between the prevailing narratives around this and what the science actually says. And this is why we're so excited to welcome Dr. Candace Odgers today. We have shared our bio and all the communications, but a developmental psychologist out of University of California, Irvine. She sits on the National Scientific Council on Adolescence. And we could go on and on about her bio, but basically she's amazing, and we're really excited to have her here to help translate the science of adolescence and the digital world. So with that, welcome, Dr. Odgers, and we're excited to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with everyone. So I will I'll jump right in. And this is a topic I know that is top of mind for many of you right now, either working in the field or as parents, and tons of questions come out, and the field is moving really fast. So I wanted to share with you a little bit from where I sit, which is as someone who's worked on adolescent mental health for about 25 years. And since 2008, we've been working with thousands of 10 to 14-year-olds, following them around on their devices. So, with their consent, we work with them to get reports every day on what they're doing, how they're spending their time. They wear wearable devices, we track their sleep, and we ask a lot of questions about the influence of digital technology in their daily lives. And so, the outline today is to talk a little bit about what I've seen has been happening with adolescent mental health over time and where we sit now, what the science of digital tech and adolescent mental health currently says, and where that gap is with our policy um, responses right now. And then I'm going to talk about what happens when we choose to ban, and we're choosing to ban a lot, and we're increasingly choosing to ban, whether that's smartphones in the school or social media, and then transition to the end for best practices in supporting young people. And I know there's usually a lot of questions on this, so I'm going to be sure to leave that 15 minutes at the end so we can dive right into this. But let's talk about what's going on in adolescent mental health today. So when I first started it 25 years ago, the big things we were focused on were reducing substance use and violence and teen pregnancy. And so I'm going to start off with some massive wins. So teen substance abuse has been declining. Alcohol use has been declining for decades. We look at things like youth arrest for violence, and that's been going down as well. And then I know there's like been some big conversation about the birth rate due to an article this week in the Financial Times. Happy to talk about that at the end. But the birth rate has been decreasing among US teenagers, which is something that we have tried to delay for a very long time from a public health perspective. So young people are looking great on all kinds of metrics. We are also looking at the most educated generation ever in the United States in terms of young people who've completed high school. And it's interesting when we look at all kinds of measures where older generations say that young people are maybe less empathetic or more narcissistic or not as smart, we see that they actually look much better than we did at that age on so many of these metrics. And so a lot of wins and a lot of ways that they look better than us. Now, they're we're looking at this generation that looks very good on a number of metrics, but they're also telling us that they're more worried about the world that they're growing up in. So we've heard a lot of discussion about anxiety and sadness, and that is something also we see. This is this is data from the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, and we have increased concerns about going to school in terms of safety concerns. So these are the females that are reporting up at about 16% of young women reporting that they're missing school because of safety concerns during this time period, and then boys at about one in 10. We've also seen an increase in youth suicide risk, and it started in about 2007, 2008, right after the Great Recession. And this is, of course, concerning. This is 10 to 14-year-olds at the very bottom, and then 15 to 19-year-olds. But perhaps it shouldn't be surprising because one of the things that we know and we've always known is that adult mental health and caregiver mental health is one of the most important predictors of how young people are doing. And adult mental health has been declining for years. So suicide rates among US adults began rising in 1999, and they've been on a steady increase. And we've started to see some tapering off recently. But really, if we start to talk about the adolescent mental health increase, the increase among adults was well on its way. So some parallel trends there. Um, Many people will ask me, and they're focused on this period between, they draw lines at different places. So 2012, 2010, 2008, when smartphones and social media became more prevalent. And they say, what else could have happened to explain this increase in youth suicide, for example, during this time? And I'm just going to give you one of the things that we see as being important to consider. So the first thing is 1.2 million children in the United States lost a parent to firearms or overdoses, right? Um, this was between, actually, this should say between 2001 and 2021. But the rate of loss due to firearms or drug overdose doubled between 2011 and 2021 for parents, right? So we're seeing this increase in parental deaths, which is the tip of the iceberg in terms of a warning sign for mental health, telling us that the adults are not okay. And so there's a lots of debate about whether or not we're in a youth mental health crisis. I've been in this field for a long time, and I've always thought that we've underinvested in young people and youth mental health. And so whether or not there's an increase or not, I still think we need more attention directed at this. But it is very clear that one of the things we're not talking about as much, but is true, is that we're in the midst of an adult mental health crisis. And remember what I said, that caregiver mental health is the most important predictor in our studies and many others of how young people are doing in terms of mental health. Right. So the mental health concerns among teens are not new, but the profile today looks very different. So we've seen this decrease in externalizing and an increase in being worried and sad and a slight uptick in suicide. But really, we're seeing these trends among adults, and it started much, much earlier as well. So to put that into context. Now, despite these concerning trends among adults, many, many people say that smartphones and social media are to blame. In fact, I can't engage in a conversation about adolescent mental health without social media being either the center point of that or the thing that everyone converges on as being the main problem. And this started, of course, long before the anxious generation, but really exploded as Jonathan Haidt made the argument that smartphones and social media are rewiring our children's brain and are responsible for an epidemic of mental illness among our youth. And there's been a special interest in girls in this time period. And we've seen bans. We're seeing now one of the first social media bans in the world in Australia that went into place in December in 2025. And the headlines like this are constant, telling parents and telling policymakers that social media is responsible for these concerning trends that we're seeing among young people. Now, I want to stop and say we've been here before, and I know that many people have heard the moral panic argument, but I think it is useful just to put this in context. So when you go back, and many people have done this in a really lovely way, analyze the kind of language that's used about new technologies, everything from the pen to bicycles to rock and roll. I highlighted Pac-Man in red because that's the game of my youth that was going to destroy my brain. And here are a few news clips from that time, right? So Pac-Man was banned in a town. It was blamed for being responsible for burglaries due to the children being addicted to the game and stealing quarters. They proposed a Pac-Man age limit. The Surgeon General has at that time weighed in as previous ones here on social media, talking about the hazards to youth mental health. And now I'm not saying that artificial intelligence and digital technology is a moral panic. Things are changing quickly, and we need to have a balanced view of minimizing risks and optimizing opportunities. But I think there are some lessons to be learned here as adults, knowing that the impulse is going to be to blame digital technology, and the impulse is going to tie it up into a villain. And social media companies are certainly, and tech companies more generally, are certainly an easy villain to pin this all on. So I think it gives us pause. I don't think it's the whole story by any means, but it does raise this question of whether we should be checking our assumptions or the things that we believe to be true against data. And that's what we do a lot of the time because we've had this front row seat to understanding adolescent mental health as they have gone through their daily lives from their phones. And I think, if I had to summarize over a decade of research, I would tell you that the most consistent finding that we find is this massive disconnect, right, between the story that we are repeatedly told. And I'm a parent of teenagers. I spend a lot of time with young people as a coach and as a researcher. And there's just this massive disconnect between the story that we're repeatedly told about our young children and our teenagers and what science has found so far. And so let me take you through a little bit of the gap. And before I do that, I also want to say that it's not just me. As like the lone skeptic out here, I'm probably somebody who comes out and says it the quiet part out loud in public more often than most. But the National Academy of Sciences, so one of the most well-respected scientific organizations in the world, convened an expert panel. They met, they reviewed the evidence, they took testimony, and here was the conclusion from the executive summary of their report, or one of the conclusions showing that what we see are these small effects, really weak associations, could be good or bad, and that contrary to this current cultural narrative that it's universally harmful, it's more complicated, right? But complicated does not really sell, and it doesn't scare people, which then sells things. And so this message really hasn't resonated or gotten out to the public. Now, what does the evidence actually say? So we've done some reviews, or many people that have done reviews and meta-analysis, and we are just drowning in correlational data right now, looking at the relationship between digital tech of all forms, including social media, and well-being of various forms. And what you find is these mix of small negative, small positive, and mostly null findings. So 80 to 90% of the studies have been single time point and correlational, so it makes it hard to do this separation of cause and effect. And often what has been done is you ask an adolescent at the same time, how do you feel? How have you been feeling over the past 30 days or 6 months? And then how often have you used social media? And they correlate those two things. Now, when we do that, they tend to find that the association between the two will explain about less than 1% of the variation, and often the time it's null. And it's critical, like the vast majority of studies here really can't distinguish cause from effect. Now, recently, there have been some studies that have been able to do this in an experimental framework, and I was excited because now we can get out of this, arguing over what a correlation of, 0.10 or 0.105 means and not knowing the directionality. These are studies that have, and there's now over 40 of them. We've done an updated review, but this is a review done by Chris Ferguson and then also by Caitlin Burnell, meta-analyses that have pulled all of the studies that have essentially randomly assigned people to give up social media and then follow them over time and understand, what has happened in terms of their reports of well-being. And reviewing these studies, there's a couple of things that really stood out to me, and I've just put them here. The first one is that the study design is really biased to find an effect, right? So we're in an environment where everyone's told that detoxing from social media is good. And in fact, many of these studies recruit by saying, come and detox and, feel better about giving up social media. And then they ask people how they feel after they give it up. So that's not ideal from a medical standpoint, from a clinical trial standpoint. But putting that aside, even when we do that, if we take the average effects, Chris shows that they can't be distinguished from zero. Caitlin shows that they're a tiny positive effect, but they conclude that essentially this is not a big enough effect, even if it's causal, to target interventions around. And the most stunning thing for me is there's not a single study that includes young people under the age of 16. No one. There's not even a single study that includes an average age of 18. So what we're doing is we're essentially taking a bunch of research on adults that doesn't really even show positive effects of giving this up and assuming that it's going to work for young people. So before we ban, we've argued here and other places is essentially we should probably test this as well. Now, the other pieces of evidence are longitudinal research, and this is really interesting because I think what it's showing us is that social media might be on the wrong side of our equation. People are asking the questions, what does tech do to kids? And the more interesting question is, why do young people go into digital spaces? What are they looking for? How they're feeling at the time influence how they're using technology? And these are the types of studies that we do because we like to look at using each person as their own control. So many of the prior studies have really looked at comparing a young person who spends 1 hour of media time on media a day versus someone who spends maybe 8 hours or 6 hours on social media a day or on digital tech a day. And those are very different young people coming from very different families and have a very different structure of their daily routine. So we know that children growing up in high income households, for example, are very scheduled to the point they only have 1 or 2 hours per day. And that's really a function of, the cost of extracurricular activities and the types of kind of personalization to their daily lives. It happens when adults are invested in shaping that. And then the necessity in lower income households of unsupervised time and fewer resources to invest in making sure that they're busy all day, right? So we have this digital divide that comes up. So what we like to do in our studies is ask the question, when we follow an individual, an adolescent over time, does a different amount of digital tech use, like social media or like gaming, influence things like their sleep that night or their mood that day? And we compare them to themselves. So on a day that they used more or less technology. And when we do that, we get lots of information. We draw from a representative study of children in North Carolina. So we get young people across the entire spectrum of SES, race, ethnicity, about 2,000 of them. And with about 400 of them, we've followed them over time intensively. This one study for 14 days, we have a new study of 3,000 young people that is following them for 750 days. We've done it where we followed them for 90 days, use of passive sensing. But you end up with a lot of data and the ability here to identify really small effects if they are there. And these are the two researchers who led these projects, Mikey Jensen at UNCG and Madeline George at RTI now. And when we do this and use each childhood as our own control, we find that we can, predict daily symptoms from a wide range of things that we've always known have predicted young people's mental health symptoms and problems, right? So conflict in the home, pressure to do well at school, those are two of the most commonly reported things. Things like discrimination, exposure to family, neighborhood, and violence, sleep duration, quality, all of these things predict youth mental health at a daily level and over time. What doesn't predict is digital technology use. So we find no linkages, and this was surprising to us when we first found it, and we've since replicated it, and other people have as well. No daily linkages between digital tech usage and daily mental health. And this was, surprising to us. There's a recent study with about 10,000 adults that had done this using passive sensing and affect measures over time for a month. And again, they found no associations between social media use or other app use and affect. I should note that our passive sensing data studies that we've done recently have shown that this direction again might be reversed when we do find it. So we see that negative affect in the morning predicts more passive engagement if we look at number of taps or number of text entered into the phone, but we find kind of no evidence for the other direction of passive use or active use predicting affect, sleep, etc. So there's also new data from about 26,000 adolescents in the UK, and again, they find no associations again. So again and again, we're seeing that many of these very large, well-designed studies, when they're controlled or if they're looking over time, if they're an experiment, find no evidence that time spent on social media or gaming predict later internalizing problems and symptoms among girls or boys. And so I'm not saying the evidence is perfect. I'm not saying like if we had different measures and we're more focused on content or had a different way of capturing the digital ecosystem and the young people are in, that we wouldn't find some negative effects. And we've tried to look for subgroups and see if some subgroups are more vulnerable, and that's a very good hypothesis. What I am saying, though, is the current claims that are being made in the media and policy and how we are mobilizing around this as social media being a major predictor of adolescent mental health problems does not match the data. In fact, one of the biggest studies led by someone in this group here concluded that when you look at the traditional risk factors, that social media is one of the least influential factors in adolescent mental well-being. So there's just this massive gap. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second and I'm going to ask. I'm sure that for some of you, you might not have heard this perspective before. You probably have some questions that are coming up for you right now. We want to make sure that those get integrated into the chat. So if you can take a second and drop some questions into the chat, we'll make sure that we come back to these in the discussion section to follow. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to point out before we get to the solutions is I think, as I've thought about this massive gap, the thing that I keep coming back to, and the reason for this is something that I think we all know to be true, is that scary stories sell, right? And they're really easy to sell to parents. We are just an anxious lot to begin with. And the more often you hear something, so 40 years of comms research has shown us that the more often you hear something, the more likely you are to believe it is true. So many people believe that this is true. Some advice I want to give when you hear these stories or you see a graph that's included in, for example, the Financial Times or um, another publication that's trying to tell you how kids these days are worse off than we were, or that the worst ever in the world, or damaged in some way, that I really think, and much of it started with this article in The Atlantic by Jean Twenge, who basically made the claim that smartphones have destroyed a generation, with a question mark. And people have been using these kinds of graphs ever since. But I'm going to give you an example of what they tend to do. So here's kind of a typical graph, and this looks at well-being, and it goes, in this case, they had this magical date of 2012, and they think that 2012 was the day that like social media really took off, or that smartphone saturation reached a certain level. And so this claim is that in 2012, you can see it at the very end here, we hit the brink of disaster with young people, and we fell off a cliff. Right. And this was just, you look at this and you think, wow, like kids are falling off a cliff. Like that looks like a really steep drop. So you know where I'm going here. I'm going to call your attention to the y-axis. So in my day job, I teach advanced statistics to graduate students, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how to best present our data in kind of a transparent way. You'll see that the mean here goes from 3.75 to 4.15. So I always ask, like, what's the actual scale that's on that this should be on, and what are the anchors of these numbers? And they did a good job here of at least giving us the data over time, but often they just truncate it and don't go back to the time when we were young, and we could see that we're actually worse than they are today. But here's the data. I'm going to rescale it on the original axis. So here's the data that from 2008 to 2018. That still looks like a big drop. Now I'm going to put it on the whole scale from 0 to 5. So the well-being is very good to good. So it looks like what happened around this 2012 was we went from very good to very good. Right. Now, that's a different story than being on the brink of a mental health crisis. And I can pull up plenty of examples of how this has been used more recently in terms of claiming that young people are more narcissistic or less empathetic or worse at math, right? And when we pull out the y-axis or we extend the x-axis back, we see a very different story. And so I wish news organizations would do that. I wish, whenever I see these graphs that look scary at first, I go to the original data source and I either recreate it or I pull it out. And it is stunning how many times it's just lying, lying about our kids. I don't have a nicer way to say it, actually. Okay, so this is, you might be thinking, well, this is not what Jonathan Haidt has told us about social media and digital technology. And John and I obviously have very different perspectives. I do think he's right, and that this is a movement that adults don't want this and parents don't want this. Where I think he's dead wrong is that the science supports this strong connection right now, and that these policy solutions that are being recommended based on this book are going to work to help our kids. So if you want to dive deeper into that, there's a QR code, and I'll actually share all these slides with everyone as well. Okay. So now what happens when we choose to ban? So this data that I've shown you to date has been used to say that smartphone and social medias are destroying our children's mental health. It's destroying learning. And that if we can shut down social media, if we can shut down the phones, we will solve the question or the problem of learning loss, of adult mental health. And for those of us who've worked on mental health, we know that you cannot ban your way out of a youth mental health problem, and that we don't solve problems by taking things away typically. But here we are. Australia did this. They went forward in December 2025, and this was quick. So it took about a year to get to this point where they were actually banning young people from social media. This is a really interesting policy story. It happened with, I believe, the Prime Minister's wife reading The Anxious Generation and bringing it forward and saying something needed to be done. They acted very quickly. They voted to ban social media. Then they realized they didn't know what social media was, so they had to make lists and figure out who was on the list and who was off the list. Um, and they didn't have YouTube on the list, but YouTube is the most frequently used platform by all children and adolescents. So they eventually got put on the list, and they banned it in December 2025. And the amazing thing about this story for me is that, having been a faculty member in a policy school, typically when you do a policy analysis, you have to wait and go a few steps beyond the policy to look at how it might fail. On day one in Australia, what they did was they shut down something like 2 million accounts at YouTube. Well, the kids were not banned from YouTube. They could still get on YouTube and access everything. What they were kicked out of was their accounts, which included content moderation, age appropriate material, parental controls. Sesame Street moved to YouTube in December or in the fall as well. And so it was just a really interesting action which stripped young people off of these off of these accounts, but did not kick them off the platforms. And I think we're seeing this now as the new evaluations come out. We're seeing that, the vast majority of young people in Australia are still on social media. It's really hard to kick them off. They're smarter than us. Many people argue that the companies need to be doing more, and that's probably fair because when you can fool the age verification software with a picture of your dog, right? Or by drawing a mustache on, we know computer vision is better than that, but it is providing young people with lots of opportunities to get around adult imposed bans. Now, despite this, countries around the world are rushing to ban social media, and there might be many good reasons to try and do that. But if we actually want young people to change their behavior, we know that top-down authoritative bans are not the way to get there and to motivate change. And so this will be a very interesting exercise. My postdoc, Monica Neff, has led a paper where we collected all of these experimental studies that Chris and Caitlin had done and updated it to the new ones to ask this question, do we have any evidence that social media bans um, will support young people or will work with young people? And again, it's clear there's not one study that includes them, and the study with adults are not that convincing. So we do find that, clearly kicking kids off is really hard. Australia is finding this as well. The age verification is very interesting because we now have to violate the rights of everyone. So to find out if a user is 16, now everybody has to turn over their data or their face to companies who really have a bad track record of protecting our data. They also should not be collecting child data, and we've taught our children through digital safety and digital literacy programs not to turn over sensitive or identifying information. Now we're telling them that they have to. And then everything we know about interventions with teens tell us is this probably isn't going to work. But we do know that this feels good to adults, right? And so we did a survey of California voters and found it was the only thing that independents, Democrats, and Republicans agree on, that banning social media, for kids should be done. They want it to be done. So it's a real political winner. What's not clear is whether they'll have any benefit for young people, given what I just showed you, that there does not seem to be big effects to start, and that banning young people does not seem to be an effective strategy in general for changing their behavior. So let's talk about school phone bans. There was a big paper that was just put out this year. I have a middle schooler and a high schooler, and we have the Yonder pouch, and many schools around the country are spending millions and millions of dollars on this. So I think New York, the estimated cost was $29 million. You have to buy the pouches, you have to hire the people to enforce the ban, and let's see what happens now. So this was Hunt Alcott and colleagues, and they released this paper a couple of weeks ago. And what we find when we do this kind of diff and diff analysis and compare schools with or without the ban that are matched in clever ways, that there are no effects on test scores. So that was disappointing to everyone, that we find effects that are either so close to zero that their actual size would be pretty insignificant, to indistinguishable from zero. So that was a disappointing finding. We do find that actual suspensions or discipline goes up initially and then that falls back out. So it's producing more suspensions, which is what another paper in Florida found. We don't find effects on attendance. We found decreased well-being right away and then a slight rebound. Again, this small effect that could be or probably is noise. No effects on ratings of classroom attention or online bullying. So this provides a pretty sobering view of what the bans might be doing. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitive. No study should be definitive, but this should certainly cause us to pause and evaluate whether the millions of dollars we're spending on the pouches are delivering on the promises that policymakers or people have promised in terms of improved uh, test scores, attendance, all of the things. All right, so here's just a summary of that. Now, something that I've come to conclude all this time, and I do want to stop and say I'm not pro technology. We've argued, and in fact, through the National Center for the Council on the Developing Adolescent, that stronger regulation is needed, but bans don't do that. Bans really let tech companies off the hook, and we need to clean up all of these all of these platforms for all of us, and especially for young people, because they're going to be there anyway. Even if we think we're kicking them off or we think they're banning them, trust me, we're on their phones. We can see where they are, and they will be there anyway. Um, and in many ways, adults really have broken the internet. It has become, in many dark places, a bad and unsafe place. But kicking children off will not fix that, right? And in fact, it will give tech companies some cover. I wrote about this previously in the Atlantic article, and so here's a, a code. I can send a GIF link as well. And then I think there's starting to be some movement here where people are realizing that the solution to these issues is not going to be as simple as a ban. And this was an article in The Economist in the lower screen right here. Now, what should we do instead of bans? I'm going to talk a little bit about best practices in supporting young people in the digital age, and then open this up for discussion. So it's really clear that there's panic and people are scared, and it's very tough to make good decisions as a parent or as a policymaker when we're in the midst of a panic about this. And so taking a breath, centering young people in this conversation and identifying for everything we're trying to solve. So if we are trying to solve learning loss, what are the opportunities of digital tech and what are the risks, and how can we work to balance those things? And I would say the same thing about extreme harms that happen online. So whether that's sextortion, whether that is image-based abuse, right? So how can we better protect young people while still affording them opportunities to express themselves? We have to have youth engaged solutions. So my kids will tell me that I'm not very good at this, and in part because I didn't grow up on it. We only see half of the story when we look at our young people, and we will not have a full picture of how they're circumventing the bans or how they are engaging with technology, how they're benefiting, or how they're being harmed if we do not have them at these tables with us. And we really need independent evaluations by experts, so diverse groups of them, because when these new studies come out, we're seeing time and time again how each side will take it and spin it and frame it either as a massive success or a massive failure. And that is really hard for everyone sitting there trying to understand what is the actual evidence behind this. And right now, evidence is being weaponized, but is not really playing a role in policy making. So I want to provide an example of a positive investment. And so I've argued for a long time that we are spending a lot of time having fights about digital technology's effects and searching for harms, and we're spending far less time trying to design solutions for young people. And one of the things that we know time and time again is they're more likely to go online when they're anxious or depressed, looking for help or support. And so we need to be there building the digital mental health interventions, helping to direct them to safe places to find what they're looking for, instead of just focusing all of our time on the banning, the blaming, and the arguing over correlational data. And Katie Salen is actually doing some of the most interesting work in this field. And this is one example where they run, it's called Connected Camps, and they run Minecraft camps with individuals who are trained to be moderators. And this one is for children who've lost a caregiver. So these are children who like to game or enjoy being in Minecraft, and all of the content moderators are trained in grief counseling, and they help these young children to build a space within the game that's private to pay tribute to the person that they lost. And then when they are ready and with support, they're able to share that with the other children on the platform. And I'm not saying that this will be a solution to every child who's grieving the loss of a parent, but this is one way to meet young people where they are, to design with young people, and to provide support for these young people within the digital world. The other thing that comes up a lot is that, we know a lot from developmental science on how to support young people, and there's often this fear that because digital tech is not something we grew up with or that we know as much as we need to know or think we need to know about it, that we're at a loss with strategies for parenting our children. That is simply not true. So the same strategies that we know have always worked in parenting and teaching and coaching, they still work, right? So tech has not changed that. It's a different setting to start to mediate and try to understand, or sometimes go into these settings with our young people. But we know a lot more than we think we do, or we're being told that we do. And the one of the books that I love is a former member of the council, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. So David Yeager, many of you might know him, former middle school teacher, psychologist, best-selling author. And he gives these wonderful case studies combined with the science of how we can set high expectations for our young people for them to succeed and offer high support in getting them there. And that is very different than telling our young people that their brains are damaged, that they are destroyed, that they are addicted, that they have no agency, right? And then taking things away. So that is this is a very different problem frame and a very different set of efforts to support our young people. Okay, this is also a great resource for people, the American Academy of Pediatrics. So Jenny Radesky and Megan Morono run the social media and youth mental health website. And it's been funded by the Center for Disease Control, and they put out new digital media guidelines for younger children and some resources on how to support that. And they also have a ton of resources on this page for people and for young people who are looking for solutions within this space. Um, and so with that, I'm gonna end. I'm gonna ask you to think about how this different narrative might apply what you've learned today in your life or work, and open this up for discussion with all of you, and thanking my incredible team for all the work that they have done as well.
So as people are putting in their thoughts around that into the chat, if yeah, we're gonna ask people just put the raise hand function up, and we'll. There were so many questions. I know we won't be able to get to them all, but we will start with Jenny, who looks like the first one on my screen.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks, Dr. Eggers. This was a really, really helpful presentation. I'm from the Youth Law Center, and we do a lot of work with youth in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And I think we've been thinking a lot about um, really leveraging technology for young people and also keeping in mind the things you're talking about in terms of protection, but seeing that as you noted, kind of this trend of restriction, that is definitely most of the time the system response, not just to technology, but to a lot of things. And I guess I just wondered in your research if if you or others are thinking about this. I think what we're trying to do is one, address the issue of access. I mean, that's kind of a foundational problem, I think, for a lot of system involved youth. We can't even rely on necessarily regular access. But if you were able to get over that, because we do know youth are able to access, they are accessing technology and social media. If you or other researchers are just thinking like about both what additional vulnerabilities there might be,
Yeah.
as well as strategies for um, providing youth specific guidance and other support so that
Yeah.
they also benefit from how young people are really using technology to connect, but also just about navigating, resources, higher education, training, things like that. I know those are big questions, but just wondered
No,
if that's beginning in the field of an area of inquiry.
yeah, so I think it's a great question. I actually started my career working in juvenile justice with justice involved young people and with children, sexually exploited youth. And so I think this is critically important because one of the other big, the massive gap is the first big finding. The second big finding is that offline risk mirrors online risk. And so we see time and time again that young people that don't have supportive networks around them to help scaffold digital technology use and supervise and set safety controls, and who might have a network that exposes them to more risk, encounter more risk online, right? And so there's this tricky situation where you have a group that has the most to gain by having these technologies leveraged to give them access to things that they might not have access to in their physical environments. But there's also the most heightened risk among this group of young people in terms of further exploitation or not having the digital safety skills in place to help protect them. And so, the safety by design is one part of this, but also having system level people trained as they navigate reentry, as they're navigating different systems around, digital safety, around trying to understand how these risks might play out for them differently. But it's a huge issue, and people are starting to kind of move more into the space. And that's one of the things I've argued, that it's not actually the mental health problem, which is many of the people pushing for the bans are from very affluent communities and networks. But what the real risk here is not building systems that support young people who don't have the types of adult support that are curating these technologies and giving them the best of the tech.
Thank you.
We have a lot of people who lead organizations, academics, a whole plethora of people, but also a lot of parents on the call. So, curious if you can talk a little bit to the parents around, what you would advise or thoughts that you have around parenting in the space.
Yeah, so this is the ultimate translation of research and evidence to like your house, right? And I live this right now. The one I give two pieces of advice. One is don't look at the phone first, right? And so it is so compelling for us to see problems being rooted within the technology of the phone, but ask yourself, is my child, doing the types of things that they need to be healthy right now? So are they sleeping well? Are they engaged with or enjoying and doing well in school? Do they have friends, right? Do they have something that they're passionate about or they're engaging with, outside of that? And if those things are going well, then the fight over screen time is probably not worth it, right? And you have to kind of pay attention to that. The other thing is this transition into technology is really tricky, and people have to figure out like when that works best for their family. But one of the biggest things that I learned from the young people in our study is that, young people, just like in the offline world, are going to encounter all kinds of risks and things that they're going to need adults help with. And the biggest thing that they are afraid of is having their tech taken away. And so many kids do not tell adults or trusted adults that they've encountered something that is scary, that is frightening, that is upsetting, that they don't understand, because they worry, and they're probably right, that the first thing that will do is take the phone away. And so the big conversation I have with my kids is that no matter what happens on this device, I want you to talk to me, and I will never take it away because you've told me, that you need help with something. And I think that's, it's just a missed opportunity for parents. And I had to learn it from the young people in our study before I could do it in my own house. So
That's amazing. Thank you. Justin, turn to you.
Hello. Hi, Candace. Thank you, Andy. I'm Justin from Philadelphia Outward Bound School, and this topic is constantly on my mind at home and at work, but at home for an 8-year-old, less about social media, but digital technology use. But I think you're absolutely right. I've seen time over time that the districts are inherently risk adverse and are looking for a kind of line item blanket solution to say they've done something, and it kind of avoids the harder work of actually figuring out like what are students' needs, interests, and then kind of finding a way that the school can really facilitate that at scale, whether that's community building that students might be seeking through social media use, connection, whatever it might be, a way to express yourself in a non-traditional setting, all of these things, right? So I guess what I'm looking for is recommendations on how to articulate to decision makers at schools that the work needs to be more about offering what you described too as a balance, right? And we do outdoor experiential learning, which we're not going to serve kids every day, but there's a place for kids to kind of develop skills in a different setting. But it's not meant to be an absolute solution, right?
yeah.
And so I just try to think like how can we recenter the conversation around really like we're talking about health. It's same thing around like, coming back to traditional academic metrics. Like we know that they aren't necessarily correlated to health in the way that we should be driving at when we're trying to educate a whole child. But I just feel like it's taking the conversation away from that and putting it squarely on kind of this as a root evil.
Yeah, I mean, that is the question that I mean, if you have an answer, I'd love to hear it. I've been trying to take the temperature down because, it's this fear that, people are operating, and there's not ill intent, right? I don't think that there's ill intent on the part of the decision makers. It is just, it's a seductive solution. People are scared, and it seems like this could be a silver bullet. And we know that silver bullets don't work, and especially with young people and all of those types of things. I think the trickier thing for me is the message that we're telling. There's a message we tell policymakers, but then there's the messages we're telling our young people that don't match their lived experiences or reality or needs. And so we become increasingly out of touch, and we set this up as this battle versus something we can solve together. We set this up as this intergenerational battle between the olds who are going to take everything away and, think your brain is rotten, and this next generation that really needs a lot of support to navigate these spaces. And, one of the concerns right now, as AI comes into the picture, and that becomes part of the workforce of the future, there's all kinds of reasons to be worried about that. But the movement right now to ban kind of AI or use of it in schools. What is going to happen is the rich are going to send their kids to camps that are run on my campus and Stanford on digital tech, and lower income kids are not going to get the exposure through digital literacy. So you're exactly right. We need to find this middle ground where we can safely scaffold young people into the use of these digital technologies, and we're going to have to get them to help us do that.
Yeah.
Because
I think of it as like cross training. And like we have to be, and because there's students on the other side of the workforce development conversations are all about helping students make this transition into a technology and AI centered
yeah,
workforce. So I just again feel like we're staying in a siloed issue solution rather than really like recognizing what is a continuum of experiences that young people need. So, but
yeah.
I'll stop. But
No,
thank you
I love
very
that. And
much.
it's also mixed messages, right? So we're kicking kids off social
Right.
media, but then the school's using social media to promote the events and the student government. Like and then we're telling
Right.
kids they have to be ready for the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Eduardo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eduardo. I work at the Center for Digital Thriving at Harvard, and I really appreciate the piece that you mentioned about, there's so many studies out there, specifically qualitative studies, RCTs, and one thing as like someone who's on that research side is that these studies take so long to do, and the technologies evolve and change, and our relationship to them and young people's relationship to them is evolving as like AI is folded into these things that really just complicates the entire picture. And when we finally publish something in a journal article and it's used for policy, it's like 3 years old, and the interventions feel like we need to be doing something fresh and new. And I'm curious, like from the research angle, like how can we as researchers do a better job of translating some of the findings more quickly and making sure that they are actually helpful for young people in the moment, because it feels like we are sort of lagged behind
Yeah.
all these changes that are just constantly happening with each app and with each sort of like update that comes, then young people are just using these technologies inherently differently because the technology is like prompting them to use it differently.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'd say when the National Science Foundation was a functioning organization, they had a mechanism called RAPID, which we used to get like quick takes on kind of AI use among parents, teachers, and children. And that was like incredibly helpful. And so hopefully other agencies and funding agencies will come up with that kind of rapid mechanism where you don't have to wait as long to try and get a study supported and funded. So you can be in the field quickly and then rapidly turn that around. The other thing we've moved to is we have a standing youth advisory panel. So we no longer do it study by study, but we bring young people in. We have a cross-national panel. They're constantly reviewing our protocols or giving us feedback on kind of the designs or what they're using, and so that we can work and get a glimpse into kind of how they're thinking about technology and what they're using. So we're not studying Facebook when they're on to AI. Um, the other part of this I would just say is that there's this idea technology does move fast, and you are right, but some of the principles remain the same. And so some of the things that we will know, from past movements is that every new technology, young people will be there first, right? They will be early and enthusiastic adopters. So are all the companies that say kids aren't here, the kids are there, they're going to be there before us, right? And so they'll be in these spaces first. And the second one is that a lot of these are transferable skills around kind of digital safety and literacy. And so if we can find those components, the tech can change, right? But the ability to kind of self-regulate in a digital environment, the ability to try and keep your information safe, which is harder and harder without the structural part of it. Um, but those types of principles, if we can locate those, then I think we could have a more general solution that isn't wedded necessarily for the specific tech.
And we're coming up close on time, but I would like to end on something very opportunity focused. So, we talk a lot about youth isolation and community, and just curious your thoughts around like the community that this digital space could create when we're looking forward.
Yeah, so it's definitely the case that young people are creating their communities online. And I think one of the most interesting things I see now is this whole media is about the whole discussion is about social media and banning social media. Social media isn't really social anymore. It's parasocial, right? And so the social activity that's happening for young people is all happening in the chats. So in their Discord chats for gamers or in their, group text chats. And that's where all the social action is for happening to young people, and that's where they're forming their communities, mostly of young people that they also know offline. But adults are still stuck thinking about the way that we use social media, and really social media right now, the major platforms are just a different version of television, a shorter version, a weirder version, like a um, with most content being created by influencers or AI. And so I think we're going to be stuck having this old argument as adults, and young people will have moved on to create community because that's what they need, right? That's what adolescence is, a time where peers become more salient and connection becomes more salient, and they will use whatever tools are out there to extract the types of connections that they're craving. And the more, I guess, just to know, the more we adopt a ban approach, the more we're going to drive those communities underground into less safe and less regulated spaces. So if we have any hope of trying to protect those spaces and have them be kind of youth governed and owned and safe places for community, the bans are not going to get us there.
Well, on behalf of everyone at Spring Point Partners and the Center for Development Adolescence, we are so grateful for you joining us today and everyone, right? We know your time is precious, so giving us this time to be in this conversation is so important to us. So we are just thankful to everyone. Feedback's always welcome. So please let us know thoughts, ideas, things that are percolating. We like to build these sessions based on information from you all. So if there's something that this has sparked in you that you'd like a continued conversation on, please let us know. And then just stay tuned. We will be announcing the next iteration of our Adolescent Brain Science webinar series soon. But I'll just end it on one more thank you to Dr. Agers for joining us and sharing so much wisdom with us today.